So you've read the title and you've seen the thumbnail. We're about to get into every single time the web head has perished. And let me tell you, it happens a lot, surprisingly. In fact, I might have missed some, to be honest. It took me so long to find some of these issues because some of them just don't come up when you search the term in the title. Well, without further ado, let's get into these deaths.
Don't forget to absolutely smash that like button over, yeah? No worries.
Up first, Night of the Goblin. We have issue 75 of Spider-Man, which came out in October 1996. And as you can probably tell by the cover, this was one of the climaxes of the dragged out clone saga. And yes, I say one of because they fake teased that shit for years. In this issue, Peter is facing off against Norman Osborn, aka the Green Goblin.
AKA your worst f***ing nightmare.
Peter and him begin to fight, and Peter tried to tell him that he's got the wrong guy, he's not the real Peter Parker. He's just a clone. And that's when Norman drops a bomb and pulls a beaten down blonde headed Ben Reilly from the unsettled dust. The quote unquote real Peter Parker. Except he's been behind every single thing this whole time. He's been manipulating everyone into thinking that Ben is the real Spider-Man. When in fact, he's actually the clone. Peter Parker is the real Spider-Man. He's plotted against him for years, and he'd always survived, but this time was his last. They continued to fight on and on and on, page after page, until the issue finally climaxes with Peter defeating Norman and saving Ben, until his rogue glider is headed directly for Peter, but Ben jumps in the way, taking it through his back, dying. And to be honest, he stayed dead for a good 20 years, until about 2016, which was very surprising. In this issue of What If, the alien costume had possessed Spider-Man and he had never gotten rid of it. This was released in 1989. This one is a bit less convoluted than the rest in this list. It's basically what would happen if Peter could never get rid of the suit. Reed's machines doesn't work in this timeline and Peter is stuck in the suit. They have to contain him behind glass. Reed has failed with science, Doctor Strange has failed to remove it with magic, but they don't notice that they'd weaken his containment unit and he breaks free, escaping. He eventually faces off against the Hulk, but the Hulk senses fear for the first time in his life. He can sense what's about to happen. Peter leaps at him, locking onto him with his tendrils, but the alien entity senses that Hulk could be a stronger host, so it leaves Peter's body for the strongest host on Earth, leaving Peter in the dust, aged and dishevelled. The symbiote drained Peter's life force, leaving him as an 80-year-old man. Later, Reed goes to check on Peter's elderly body and finds him lying on the floor. Peter has died of old age. He is dead. Moving on to just 2 issues after that one, Peter dies again in What If X-Men Lost Inferno. So this one is a bit more fatal than the last. Demons take over the planet, killing all of the X-Men. But Wolverine survives. Because of course he does. The man survives fucking everything. But he gets possessed. Most of the heroes on Earth get turned evil, except of course, your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. Wolverine goes on one of his famous rampages and plunges his adamantium claws into the back of Spider-Man, ending him for good. Marvel Knights Spider-Man. These issues released in like 2005, some under Marvel's infamous Marvel Knights imprint. Also, that Marvel Knights Daredevil run is actually one of my favourite runs of all time. But back to the webhead. In issue 526 of The Amazing Spider-Man, Morlun, the Spider-Man vampire as I like to call him, he shows up and he can suck the life force from other spider people, giving him superhuman abilities. Him and Peter go toe to toe, battling each other across the sea. The whole issue is basically one big scrap and I absolutely love it. But Morlun is seemingly too strong for Peter. No matter how hard Peter hits, it does no damage. Morlun grabs Peter's eye and pulls it from its socket, eating it, and it's so nasty. And then he proceeds to pummel him into oblivion, finally ending the tale of Peter Parker. Uncanny X-Men 191. This issue was released in 1984. a classic Chris Claremont story. In this issue, Manhattan is transformed into a Hyborian era reality by the evil Kulan Gath. The evil sorcerer has Spider-Man strung up, intending to sacrifice the wall crawler to make his spell expand the entire globe. Using the last of his strength, Spidey breaks free, ready for one final attack on the heathen. But it's not enough. He is magically struck down for the final time, ending his life once more. Infinity Gauntlet Issue 4. This issue came out in 1991 with the art by the legendary George Perez. And I won't go into too much detail on this one because everyone and their nanny knows the Infinity Gauntlet story with Endgame and whatnot. Obviously it's a bit different than the comics, but it's the same vibe. Thanos tries to take over everything and everyone and blah blah blah, right? So everyone dies. Literally everyone. But Spider-Man's is probably the most brutal. I'm going to show you every death in this issue because why not? So Namor and She-Hulk die in the same way. Thanos attaches some sort of weird substance to their bodies and it grows and grows and grows until they can no longer breathe and they suffocate. Wolverine attacks, stabbing Thanos in the chest, but of course that does nothing. Thanos turns his adamantium skeleton to rubber, and he dies a slow, painful death. Wanda and Cyclops are both fighting him at the same time. He force blasts Wanda from existence, then he turns Cyclops' head into a clear block, stopping his lasers and his oxygen. He grabs Vision, plunging his fist through his chest, pulling out his circuits, killing him. And back then, Thor was still an ordinary man named Eric Masterson, who turned into Thor when he touched Mjolnir. We had lost Mjolnir in the fight, and he suffocates in the vacuum of space. Cloak sucks Thanos into the Dark Dimension, but can't hold him any longer and implodes from the power. Iron Man gets his head pulled off by Thraxia, and that's when Spidey attacks, but Thraxia grabs him and begins to beat his head in with a rock, killing him. Spectacular Spider-Man 263. This issue was released in 1998. And it's the Green Goblin again, of course. But this one is pretty straightforward. Peter and Norman begin to fight, and the battles rages on, and for a while, Norman gets the upper hand, and he eventually unmasks Peter, before hitting him with a goblin bomb, killing him. He then goes on to celebrate in front of everyone, showing off his biggest achievement, the death of Spider-Man. Amazing Spider-Man 700, aka Superior Spider-Man. This issue was released in 2012, and at the time the storyline divided fans because this is the notorious storyline where Doc Ock becomes Spidey. And I know now it's considered like a modern classic, but at the time it wasn't. After they mind swap, Doc Ock's body begins to deteriorate and eventually dies. But in this story, Peter's psyche fights back and reclaims his body eventually, but I'm counting it anyway because the death was in there. Ultimate Spider-Man. This issue was released in 2011. In Spider-Man's heroic death in the Ultimate Universe, he takes a bullet for Captain America, shot by the Punisher, who then regrets shooting Spidey and turns himself in. After the gunshot wound was deemed non-fatal, Spider-Man continued to fight and eventually ends up facing the Sinister Six, whom he defeated after a grueling battle where his injuries took a toll. Just as it seemed he was going to survive the ordeal, a nearby truck explodes, critically injuring him, which eventually causes his death. Following his death, of course, it leaves the way for Miles Morales to take up the mantle of Spider-Man. Marvel Zombies. Now with Marvel Zombies, I'm just gonna combine them because there's a few. I'm not gonna give you the backstory of every single one of them because it's basically the same every time. There's a zombie outbreak and he becomes a zombie. Ta-da! I'm just gonna skim through some of the pictures because I really think it's a cool concept. And of course, every time they decide to do one of these books, Spider-Man bites the bullet. He's the cash grab, by the way. But I'm not complaining. Zombie Pete is definitely cool. X-Men Days of Future Past Doomsday. This is a more recent issue coming out this year. It's basically a retelling of the classic X-Men storyline with a few deviations. But in this version, Peter is trying to help out the X-Men by trying to calm down an angry mob. But they mistake him for a mutant, and he eventually lets them beat him to death. because he doesn't want to hurt anyone. I did a whole video on this and on my channel because I wasn't too happy on the lazy writing. Letting him go out like that, like a bitch? No. Spider-Man would not let that happen. Marvel Runes. Runes released in 1995. And it's basically what the Marvel Universe would look like if everything didn't go the hero's way. I made a video about this on my channel too. But in this universe, Spider-Man is bitten by the spider. But instead of getting the wonderful powers we know and love today, he just gets radiation poison and he dies a pretty grim death. Before we end up the video, I have a few honourable mentions for you. Kraven's Last Hunt. This was released in 1987, and I know what you're going to say, he doesn't actually die, blah 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 blah. But it looks cool, okay? So Kraven sets out to prove he's better than Spider-Man, and he buries him alive and takes up his mantle becoming Spider-Man. And we all know how that ended. Spider-Man breaks out, takes back his life. Kraven endgames himself with his rifle. But it's cool as fuck, so I wanted to mention it. In one of the recent Spider-Verse stories, Spider-Man gets taken from the web of life. He is stabbed by a sacred dagger and wiped from existence. But, as in all Spider-Man comics, he eventually comes back and actually introduces the new Spider-Boy into the story. And obviously take every death with a grain of salt, because they will never kill Spider-Man off. He's their moneymaker. They can release a Spider-Man book and have every page blank, and people will buy it not looking inside. That's how popular Spider-Man is. But yeah, if you like the video, if you like this type of video more than my other videos, let me know. Like, comment, share, subscribe. Peace.